We have seen 4 core principles of BPR. Let us now illustrate these principles using the equipment rental process that we have used in the context of qualitative process analysis. In this process, a site engineer creates an equipment rental request, sends it to a clerk, and the clerk enters the requirements of the site engineer, for example, in a supplier's catalog system, checks for the availability of an equipment that fits the requirements, and then recommends that the equipment be rented to the works engineer, and the works engineer reviews the rental request and either approves it or rejects it. In this process, we observe that there are 3 handovers. There is first a handover from the site engineer to the clerk. The site engineer submits the rental request and the clerk takes it over and tries to find a suitable equipment and check its availability. There is then a handover from the clerk to the works engineer who has to approve the request. And then finally there is a handover back from the works engineer to the clerk who has to then produce the purchase order to rent the equipment. BPR allows us to try to compress this process and eliminate these handovers. Specifically, principles 1 and 2, capturing information once and at the source, and integrating information processing work with the real work where this information is produced, will tell us that we should consider having the site engineer doing the work of querying the supplier's catalog. In other words, not only expressing high-level requirements, but actually going into the supplier catalog and determining what specific equipment they need. Then they will select the equipment and potentially even trigger the purchase order. Principle 3 tells us that we should consider pushing the coordination of the work back to the stakeholder who consumes the output of this process. The output of this process is, in essence, a payment that the construction company will make to the provider of rented equipment. It's the provider of rented equipment, the supplier, who has the incentive to get this process finished so that they get paid. Therefore, Principle 3 tells us we should consider pushing the coordination of the work and the decisions to this stakeholder, meaning the supplier of rented equipment. This could be achieved by applying a principle similar to vendor managed inventory control, which is, for example, that the supplier will stock equipment that is frequently used at the construction site in or near the construction site, so that site engineers can immediately, for example, scan it and put it into use. And when they scan it, a message is sent to the supplier so that the supplier knows that the equipment is in use and can bill later for that equipment. So this is in a way similar to the notion of scan-based trading we discussed before. Finally, Principle 4 tells us that the decisions have to be integrated with the actual work. In this case, this will mean that we should consider empowering the site engineer with the authority to rent equipment without having to do handovers with the works engineer for approvals. Now you will say, like, hey, if the site engineer has all the authority, they could abuse of that authority. Power comes always with the possibility of abuse. So to address this concern, we could consider inserting what we call statistical controls into the process, meaning that in this case the works engineer will control what is being rented and why for a certain sample of cases, not for all cases, but just for some cases. For example, at the end of each week or at the end of each month, the site engineer will review the equipment that has been rented by a given site engineer and determine if the rental behavior of the site engineer is compatible with the principles the works engineer wants to enforce and is also compatible with the budget of the construction project. So in essence, Principle 4 tells us empower more and check better. This concludes our presentation of the 4 principles of BPR. And it gives us an idea of how BPR tries to be analytical. It is based on a certain number of principles that are clearly defined and that can be applied if we have a very clear description of the process at hand, or a very clear understanding of the process. It is inward looking because we are always constrained by the original scope of the process. We don't try to go too far away with respect to the scope that we have set before. It is transformative in the sense that some of these principles actually demand very major changes in the process. Like, for example, the first principle requires either putting in place self-service or having a shared database shared by all process workers. And this in general entails major IT changes, major changes in the IT systems.